He tapped his flashlight against the tinted glass and smirked, already certain he knew what he was looking at. Officer Dale Pruitt had spent 13 years making decisions like this one, quick, unchallenged, and final, and not once had the world pushed back in a way that cost him anything real. He was about to find out in the most spectacular and permanent way imaginable why that was about to change. Because the man sitting perfectly still inside that vehicle wasn't a criminal, wasn't a suspect, wasn't afraid of the badge pressed against the window. He was a special operations officer for the Executive Protection Division of the POTUS Security Detail, the last line of defense between the President of the United States and everything the world might send against him. And in 47 minutes, the most powerful motorcade in America was going to pass through this exact intersection. What Pruitt also didn't know: the vehicle he was trying to impound weighed 10,000 pounds, was built to survive a rocket-propelled grenade, and had an onboard automated defense system that was about to do something to a city tow truck that no one on Colton Avenue was going to forget for a very long time. Buckle up. This is the story of how one arrogant cop tried to move the immovable and permanently destroyed his own life in the process. If you believe that real accountability still exists in this country, hit that subscribe button right now, because what's coming is going to remind you why it matters. Let's go. To anyone passing by on the sidewalk that Tuesday evening, the dark Chevrolet Suburban parked in the loading zone on Colton Avenue looked like absolutely nothing worth a second glance. Maybe a private car service driver killing time. Maybe somebody waiting on a relative running late from one of the offices on 7th Street. The windows were blacked out so completely that you couldn't make out a shadow inside. And the engine was barely idling just enough to keep the climate control running, without drawing the kind of attention that a cold engine sitting too long in the wrong neighborhood tends to draw. No markings on the body, no logo, no identifier of any kind. Just a big, dark, anonymous vehicle parked where it had every right to be, doing absolutely nothing that should have concerned anyone passing by. That was, of course, entirely the point. Inside the vehicle, Marcus Webb sat with both hands resting lightly on his thighs, not gripping, not tense, but resting the way a man rests his hands when stillness is not the absence of action, but a specific form of readiness. His dark eyes moved in slow, methodical sweeps across the intersection ahead, taking in the foot traffic, the vehicle flow, the way the afternoon light angled off the glass storefronts on the east side of Colton, the small irregularities that most people filter out as noise, and that Marcus Webb had spent 6 years learning to read like a second language. A delivery driver doubled-parked briefly in front of the sandwich shop, hazards on, ran in with a bag, ran back out, pulled away. A woman in scrubs crossed at the light heading north, her phone out, not watching where she walked. 2 boys on bikes cut through the intersection from the west, neither of them stopping. On the far corner, a man in a plaid jacket lit a cigarette and leaned against the wall of the hardware store. Not going anywhere in particular. Nothing wrong, nothing out of place. Marcus reached for the stainless steel travel mug in the center console and took a slow sip of black coffee, his eyes never leaving the street. What those passing strangers could not see, what they had absolutely no way of knowing, was that the vehicle surrounding Marcus Webb was not a Suburban in any meaningful factory sense. The body panels were genuine Chevrolet on the outside, but beneath them, where a standard truck had sheet metal and empty space, this one had military-grade composite armor plating capable of absorbing direct rifle fire. The windows, tinted to near black, were 3 inches of layered ballistic glass that could take a rocket-propelled grenade and spiderweb without shattering, without losing integrity, without admitting so much as a fragment. The engine block beneath the hood sat inside a reinforced protective steel cage. The undercarriage was lined with blast deflection plating designed to redirect the energy of an IED away from the passenger compartment. The run-flat tires could carry the whole machine 40 miles at highway speed, with every single one of them blown out simultaneously. The whole package weighed just over 10,000 pounds and had been built, tested, and certified to one specific standard, keeping the person it was protecting alive no matter what the world threw at it. It was in every meaningful sense a fortress on wheels. And Marcus Webb was its guardian. He pressed 2 fingers lightly against the discreet earpiece in his left ear and listened to the steady rhythm of encrypted radio traffic. Call signs, grid coordinates, time checks, the particular cadence of men and women who worked in the spaces between what the public was ever allowed to know about how power moves through American cities. He understood every word, every deliberate pause, every subtle shift in tone that signaled a change in the operational picture. Overwatch 2, confirm your position. The voice belonged to Agent Donna Reeves, his comms coordinator. Her tone was what it always was, calm, clipped, professional, with the faintest trace of dry humor buried so deep that only 6 years of working together had taught him to hear it. Overwatch 2 is static at checkpoint Delta. Perimeter is clean. No anomalies. Copy that. POTUS movement is T-minus 52 minutes. Hold your position. Holding. He clicked off and returned to his sweep. Marcus had been doing this for 6 years, arriving in cities days before anyone else, sitting in vehicles exactly like this one, and watching the world move around him while he remained invisible, holding checkpoints in foreign capitals, in hostile territories in the middle of American cities that had no idea the most powerful man on the planet was about to pass through their streets. He had done this work in driving rain in brutal summer heat in the dead of winter with the engine off because running it too long drew attention. And he was, by any reasonable professional measure, exceptionally good at it. His background had made him that way, and not by accident. He had been born and raised in the Strawberry Mansion neighborhood of North Philadelphia, in a row house that his mother kept immaculate, despite working double shifts, cleaning commercial office buildings from 11 in the evening until 6 in the morning, 5 nights a week for most of his childhood. She never complained about it, at least not where he could hear her. And that silence, the particular dignity of a woman who did hard, invisible work without asking for recognition, had taught Marcus something about what real strength looked like, that no amount of military training ever needed to teach him again. He earned a full academic scholarship to Morgan State University, earned his officer's commission through ROTC, earned his Ranger tab at Fort Benning after a selection process that broke men who were by external measure physically superior to him, earned the attention after his 3rd combat deployment. Kandahar first, then a long stretch in Mosul, then a 3rd assignment. He didn't name in casual company of a quiet recruiter who had offered him something described initially in terms so vague as to be almost meaningless. It had taken 4 rounds of vetting before anyone said the words presidential protection. He had said yes without asking what it paid. Now, in the loading zone on Colton Avenue in Hargrove City with 52 minutes on the clock and the perimeter clean and the coffee going cold in his hand, Marcus Webb was doing precisely what he had been trained, selected, and trusted to do. Hold the checkpoint, monitor the comms, flag anything that looked wrong, remain invisible until the package was clear. Simple, clean, routine. He set the mug down, exhaled slowly through his nose, and watched the intersection. 49 minutes. He had no way of knowing that a black and white cruiser had just turned onto Colton from the north end of the block, or that the man driving it had already. Before he was close enough to read the plates, begun the particular internal process that was about to make 49 minutes feel like a very long time. Officer Dale Pruitt had been carrying a badge for 13 years, and in all that time, not a single thing he had done while wearing it had ever come back on him in a way that cost him anything real. He was 46 years old and had grown up in Hargrove City, 3rd generation his father, on the force his grandfather before him, the badge. A kind of genealogy rather than a career choice. He had a patrol zone he knew, block by block corner store owners, who gave him free coffee and a mental map of the city's residents divided into categories that he had never put into words out loud, but that governed every decision he made in that cruiser with the quiet, unchallenged authority of a belief that has never been seriously tested. He was, by the standards of officers who shared his worldview and his break room, a hardliner. A man who told it like it was, who didn't let the department's changing politics soften what he considered his instincts, who had seen enough of these streets to trust his gut over any policy memo. By other standards, he was something else entirely, but those standards had never carried enough institutional weight to matter. He had been passed over for sergeant twice in 2020 and again in 2022, and both times the promotion went to officers he considered less deserving, and both times he had found an explanation that had nothing to do with his own record, and everything to do with the department changing around him in ways he didn't like. The resentment of those two passed-over promotions lived in him like a splinter that had worked itself too deep to reach. Not something that hurt constantly, but something that flared whenever he felt his authority being questioned, and that had, over 4 years of festering, sharpened his need to assert himself in the one arena where he was still undeniably the man with the badge. He was thick through the middle in the way of someone who had once been genuinely athletic, and had since stopped making the effort. But his uniform was always pressed and his boots always shined because appearances were authority, and authority was the only currency he knew how to spend with any real confidence. He spotted the Suburban from half a block away, large, dark Anonymous sitting in the loading zone on the east side of Colton Engine, idling windows blacked out so completely you couldn't see. So much as a shadow inside. No commercial markings, no delivery branding, nothing. He slowed, the cruiser leaned forward against the steering wheel, squinted at it with the particular narrowing of attention that preceded for Dale Pruitt every decision he had already made about a vehicle he was still technically approaching. The plates caught his eye. Not standard state issue, the format slightly different, a federal exemption code. He knew what they were supposed to mean. He ran them from the cruiser anyway. The system returned a federal exemption flag in under 4 seconds. Pruitt stared at the return. His jaw tightened. Because what Pruitt saw first, before the plates, before the federal flag, before any piece of verifiable information, was the silhouette barely visible through the narrow gap where the window tint didn't quite reach the mirror housing. A man sitting in the driver's seat. And in the practiced, ugly shorthand that Pruitt's brain had been running for 13 years without once being successfully challenged on it, a series of assumptions fired in rapid succession, each one building on the last, none of them based on a single fact. A federal flag coming back that clean and that fast on a blacked-out vehicle sitting in a loading zone on Colton Avenue didn't read as legitimate to Dale Pruitt. It read as exactly the kind of thing someone would do if they'd gotten their hands on a stolen government plate and wanted to avoid scrutiny. He had seen it before, or a version of it, and that thin precedent was enough to close the question in his mind before it had fully opened. It did not occur to him that the flag returned in 4 seconds because it was completely legitimate. It did not occur to him that the vehicle's registration was embedded so deep in classified federal infrastructure that his department's system had barely been cleared to acknowledge its existence. It did not occur to him that the calm, still figure in the driver's seat possessed more federal authority in his left hand than Pruitt had accumulated in his entire career. None of those things occurred to him because the conclusion had already formed and settled and taken up all the available space. What occurred to him was opportunity. He climbed out, settled his belt with a practiced roll of his hips, set his expression to the particular configuration he reserved for these moments. Chin slightly raised, mouth in a thin, satisfied line. The look of a man who has already decided how the next 10 minutes are going to go and unclipped his flashlight as he walked toward the driver's window. Not because the afternoon light was insufficient, but because the weight of it in his hand was part of the statement he was making before he opened his mouth. 3 hard knocks on the glass, sharp, aggressive, the kind designed to startle the kind that said, "I own this moment," before a single word had been spoken. Inside the Suburban, Marcus Webb closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, the way a man does when he recognizes a problem he was hoping to avoid and has just had that hope quietly removed, and then opened them. "Here we go." He lowered the window exactly 2 inches. In his training, they called it controlled engagement to give the minimum necessary to initiate communication without surrendering the operational posture of the vehicle. Pruitt planted himself at the window flashlight resting against his forearm chin at that angle. License and registration. No good evening. No excuse me. Just the demand flat and immediate, as though the pleasantry would have cost him something he wasn't prepared to spend. Marcus looked at him for a moment without speaking, not with hostility, not with nerves, but with the flat measuring patience of a man who has stared at considerably more dangerous things than a small city cop with a grudge, and who has learned that the first 10 seconds of a confrontation tells you almost everything you need to know about the person across from you. What he saw in Dale Pruitt told him plenty. "I'm going to reach into my left breast pocket," Marcus said, his voice low and even. "I'm going to show you a federal credential. I'd encourage you to look at it carefully." Pruitt's eyes narrowed. He said nothing. Marcus moved slowly and with deliberate precision, the way his training had conditioned him to move in any situation where a nervous hand was hovering near a weapon, and produced a slim, hard-cased credential wallet from his breast pocket, holding it up to the 2-inch gap in the window. The badge inside was not the kind you bought at a novelty website. It was matte black, with a gold seal, clean and substantial, and beneath the seal in precise federal typeface it read, "Special Operations Officer, Executive Protection Division, POTUS Security Detail." The kind of credential that in the right circles had a way of making rooms go very quiet. Pruitt looked at it for approximately 2 seconds. Then he made a sound through his nose, short dismissive, pushed out like he was clearing it, and leaned slightly closer to the window, with the theatrical squint of a man performing confidence for an audience of one. "That's supposed to impress me." He turned the flashlight toward the badge. "I've seen better fakes at a Halloween store. You got an actual license and registration, or are we going to keep playing games here?" Marcus held the credential steady for another 3 seconds, giving Pruitt one more full opportunity to look at it, to reconsider, to access whatever part of his professional training might still be functional beneath the weight of everything else driving this stop. Then he lowered it slowly and looked straight ahead through the windshield. "Officer," he said, and his voice had shifted almost imperceptibly, the way barometric pressure shifts before weather arrives, still calm on the surface, but carrying something underneath it now, a quiet weight that a person with functional instincts would have recognized as a warning. "This vehicle is operating under federal authority in support of an active security operation. I cannot provide you with standard registration because this vehicle does not exist in any database your system has the clearance to access. What I can tell you is this: if you contact your department's federal liaison and run the exemption code on those plates through the DHS verification line, you will receive a full confirmation within 60 seconds. I am asking you professionally to do that before this situation becomes something neither of us wants it to be." It was by any reasonable measure an extraordinarily generous offer. Clear, specific, actionable, delivered without a note of condescension. Marcus had given Dale Pruitt the precise step-by-step instruction needed to walk away from this intersection with his dignity and his career completely intact. Pruitt straightened, rolled his shoulders back, and tapped the flashlight twice against the roof of the Suburban with a sharp metallic clang that echoed down the quiet block. "Sir, step out of the vehicle." Marcus did not move. "I'm asking you one more time to contact your federal liaison. And I'm asking you one more time to step out," Pruitt said, his voice rising just enough to signal escalation. You're parked illegally, your plates don't check out to my satisfaction, and right now you're obstructing a lawful order. So unless that magic badge of yours can fly, I suggest you open this door." In his earpiece, Donna's voice, "Overwatch 2 status check, T minus 46 minutes." Marcus pressed his fingers to the earpiece and said nothing. He keyed his secure channel. "Overwatch 2 to command. I have a local law enforcement contact at Checkpoint Delta. Situation is escalating. Requesting authorization to disclose operational status to resolve." The response came back in under 10 seconds. "Negative, Overwatch 2. Disclosure not authorized at your level. Maintain cover. Handle and hold." Handle and hold. Figure it out without blowing the operation. Don't reveal the president's movement. Don't escalate to federal intervention unless absolutely necessary. Marcus exhaled through his nose, looked at Pruitt still planted at the window with that flashlight and that expression, and understood with complete clarity that there was no version of this conversation that ended well. Not because he couldn't manage Pruitt, but because Pruitt had already decided. The man wasn't looking for information. He wasn't looking for verification. He was looking for a reason to feel powerful, and he had found one, and he was going to ride it all the way to the ground. Marcus opened the door. He stepped out slowly, both hands visible movements, deliberate and unhurried. 6'1", lean and composed, dressed in a dark tactical shirt and plain trousers. Nothing about him marking him outwardly as anything other than a man who had just been asked to step out of a parked car by a cop with something to prove. Pruitt was on him immediately. "Hands on the roof, spread your feet." Marcus complied without a word, both palms flat against the armored roof panel. Then Pruitt's hands began moving across him, and Marcus registered immediately that this was not a search. This was a statement, hard across the shoulders, down the sides, across the lower back, each contact carrying just enough force to be deliberately humiliating without quite crossing a line that could be formally documented. The deliberate performative roughness of a man who wants the process to feel like a punishment. And then Pruitt leaned in close enough that Marcus could smell coffee, and something stale, and said low and with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes no one is listening. "You people always gotta make it complicated, don't you? Always got some story. Always got something fancy in your pocket." Marcus said nothing. He stared at the roof panel beneath his hands and breathed. He filed the words away, not with anger, but with the cold, precise storage of a man who knows that what you document survives longer than what you feel. Pruitt found the sidearm at Marcus's hip and yanked it free with a sharp, entirely unnecessary pull. "Well, well, carrying without a visible permit. That's a problem." "That weapon is federally registered and authorized under my operational credentials," Marcus said quietly, "which you have already seen." "What I've seen," Pruitt said, already reaching for his cuffs, "is a man with a fake badge, an unregistered firearm, and a vehicle parked illegally. You have the right to remain silent." The cuffs went on tight, tighter than necessary, tight enough to be a message. Marcus was walked to the back of the cruiser, a hand pressed firmly between his shoulder blades, guided down with a push that had just enough force behind it to make a point. Door closed, lock engaged. Marcus sat in the cage and looked through the scratched partition at the Suburban 20 feet away, engine still idling secure comms, still running the entire operational nervous system of a presidential checkpoint now sitting unattended and exposed on a public street. In his earpiece, "Overwatch 2, you've missed your last 2 check-ins. Confirm status." He could not respond. Pruitt was 3 feet away outside the cruiser window, already on his radio, already calling this in to his dispatcher with the satisfied tone of a man who believes he has just made the most significant arrest of a slow Tuesday afternoon. Marcus closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then opened them and began working through the problem. Panic was a luxury that Marcus Webb could not afford, And the particular discipline of his training was that he had never confused clarity with calm. They were not the same thing, and the distinction mattered enormously in a situation where the correct response to being handcuffed in the back of a police cruiser was not to thrash or shout or burn energy on a reaction that served no operational purpose, but to catalog the situation with the same methodical precision that had kept him alive in places considerably more hostile than the back seat of a Hargrove PD cruiser on a Tuesday evening. He ran through what he knew vehicle unattended secure comms live, but inaccessible civilian tow inbound at Pruitt's request, the Suburban's onboard systems programmed to respond to unauthorized chassis contact in a way he had absolutely no ability to stop from where he was sitting. 41 minutes to POTUS movement. Handcuffed, sidearm gone. Primary comm channel blocked. What he had was something Pruitt's rough and theatrical search had missed entirely. A backup transmitter, a secondary comm unit no larger than a shirt button, clipped beneath the collar of his tactical shirt, at a position that a methodical, trained search would have found immediately, and that a performative one reliably did not. Marcus shifted, carefully angled his body so his left shoulder, pressed against the seatback, felt the faint pressure of the transmitter and pressed his chin down to activate the transmit function through contact pressure. He spoke just above a whisper. Overwatch 2 is compromised. I am in local law enforcement custody at Checkpoint Delta. Civilian tow is inbound to the vehicle. Anchor protocols will engage on contact. Requesting immediate command notification. He didn't know if it went through. He had to assume it did and keep moving. Outside, Dale Pruitt was leaning against the hood of the cruiser with his arms folded, the picture of a man fully satisfied with how his afternoon had gone. He called in his abandoned vehicle situation with the casual confidence of a man cashing in a small favor, and now he was waiting, and waiting felt good, when you were the one who had made it necessary. He glanced back through the partition at Marcus once, the offhand look of someone who has already mentally filed a problem away as solved, and then turned his attention back to the street. On the far corner of Colton and 7th, a woman stood watching all of this with a stillness that was different from the ordinary stillness of someone waiting for a bus. She was 67, black, wearing a beige cardigan, holding the leash of a small brown dog, who was very interested in a crack in the sidewalk. Her name was Evelyn Marsh, and she had retired 4 years ago after 30 years of teaching civics and American history at Hargrove City's Jefferson High School, and she had walked this corner every morning and evening for 11 years, and she had seen things on this block over those 11 years that had taught her the difference between a routine stop and something else entirely. She watched. She did not move. In Marcus's earpiece, after a pause that felt longer than its actual duration, Donna Reeves's voice returned, carrying a different tone. Now the tone of someone who has received something unexpected and is executing a protocol rather than maintaining a check-in schedule. Command has your position. Overwatch 2. A brief pause. Stand by. 2 words that Marcus had never in 6 years been more relieved to hear. Something larger was moving. He could feel it in the changed cadence of the channel traffic, the increase in activity, the specific call signs coming online, the particular shorthand that the counter-assault team used when it was transitioning from staged to active. He couldn't see any of it from the back seat of a cruiser. But he had worked in this machinery long enough to hear the sound it made when it started running at full speed. He sat back against the cage, adjusted his wrists against the too tight cuffs as best he could, and watched through the partition as Pruitt laughed at something his dispatcher said on the radio and settled in to wait for the flatbed. The tow truck arrived 14 minutes later, right on the schedule Pruitt had arranged. Heavy-duty flatbed. The kind used for commercial vehicles and larger loads, the right tool for moving something the size of a Suburban, driven by a heavy-set man in his early 50s named Calvin Briggs, who wore a gray city contractor work shirt and who climbed out of the cab chewing something and squinting at the Suburban with the professional, entirely unimpressed assessment of a man who had moved 1,000 vehicles in his career and expected this one to be no different. Pruitt met him at the front of the truck with a handshake and an easy nod. "Big one," Calvin said, circling the Suburban once. "Don't let it intimidate you," Pruitt said with the satisfied half grin of a man who has already won the argument and is now just enjoying the cleanup. Calvin shrugged, walked back to his controls, and began extending the flatbed's hydraulic lift arm toward the Suburban's front undercarriage. "Standard procedure. Hook the frame, engage the lift, drag it onto the bed. 10 minutes start to finish on a normal vehicle." Across the street, a man walking his own dog stopped on the sidewalk and looked at the scene. The police cruiser, the tow truck, the blacked-out Suburban sitting perfectly still. Something about the tableau was off, though he couldn't have said exactly what. He took out his phone, not really sure why, and held it loosely in his hand. Two teenagers on the corner of 7th, heading home from school, slowed their bikes and looked over. On the corner, Evelyn Marsh took 2 slow steps closer to the curb, her dog following without protest. The arm made contact with the undercarriage at 5:22 in the afternoon. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds, and those 4 seconds were among the most consequential of Dale Pruitt's professional life, though he wouldn't fully understand that for some time. The Suburban's onboard threat response system registered unauthorized mechanical contact with the chassis and executed its anchor mode protocol without hesitation, without warning, and without any mercy whatsoever for the equipment involved. Every wheel lock engaged simultaneously, hardened steel pins driving through the run-flat tires and into the road surface below with a series of deep, resonant thunks that were felt more than heard, the kind of impact that moves through concrete and into the soles of your feet. The electromagnetic chassis lock activated in the same instant, sending a precisely calibrated power surge back through any conductive contact point on the vehicle's exterior. The tow truck's hydraulic control system was a very conductive contact point. The results were immediate, spectacular, and absolute. The hydraulic arm seized mid-extension with a sound that was less like a mechanical failure and more like a gunshot, a sharp, cracking report that echoed off the surrounding buildings and stopped every pedestrian within half a block in their tracks. Fluid poured from ruptured hydraulic lines in dark, spreading stains across the asphalt. Every electrical display in the tow truck's cab went dark at the same moment, gauges, radio, GPS, the amber work lights on the roof, all of it going black as though someone had thrown a master switch. The engine coughed twice and died. Calvin stumbled backward from his controls with both hands raised, staring at his truck with the open-mouthed expression of a man watching something physically impossible happen in real time. Something that violated everything he understood about how hydraulics and engines were supposed to behave. The man across the street with his phone raised it almost involuntarily and started recording. The 2 teenagers on their bikes had stopped completely and were staring. A woman who had been walking past froze on the sidewalk, hand to her mouth. A small, entirely ordinary crowd of 6 or 7 people had gathered in the way that crowds gather when something on a city street announces itself as wrong, drawn by the sound, by the stillness that followed it, by the collective sense that something worth paying attention to has just occurred. Pruitt had come off the hood of his cruiser at the first crack. He stood now in the middle of Colton Avenue, looking from the ruined tow truck fluid, still spreading, cab still dark engine dead, and cooling to the Suburban, which sat exactly where it had been, completely unmoved, completely undamaged. Engine still idling with the quiet, utterly indifferent patience of a machine that had simply done what it was designed to do, and was now waiting to see if anything else required its attention. The street went very quiet. Pruitt's mouth opened, then it closed. The confident set of his jaw, the practiced tilt of his chin, the physical architecture of a man who had spent 13 years being right about everything he decided on these streets. All of it had developed a crack, and, through that crack, something was seeping in that Pruitt had not felt in a very long time. Something that had no name yet, but that his body recognized before his mind caught up with it. Calvin Briggs walked to the curb and sat down on it, placed both hands flat on his knees, and was visibly completely done. Participating in the afternoon's events, the man across the street was still recording. The small crowd on the sidewalk watched in silence. Evelyn Marsh watched from her corner with the still absorbing attention of someone filing everything away. In the back of the cruiser, through the scratched partition, Marcus watched all of it and registered the change in the operational picture. With something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite relief, but was perhaps the particular sensation of watching physics confirm what you already knew. It would confirm given the time and the circumstances. In his earpiece, Donna's voice, precise now, moving quickly, the tone of active execution rather than waiting. Command acknowledges anchor protocol activation. Code Black is live. CAD is rolling. ETA 4 minutes. 4 minutes. Marcus exhaled once through his nose, long and controlled, and looked at Dale Pruitt standing in the middle of Colton Avenue, staring at a vehicle that had just destroyed an industrial tow truck without moving an inch. 3 blocks away, a phone was already ringing in the White House Situation Room. The alert that reached the White House Situation Room at 5:22 p.m. did not ring like a normal phone. It pulsed a low, rhythmic tone that the duty officers on the floor recognized and responded to with the kind of controlled, precise urgency that comes not from adrenaline, but from years of rehearsing exactly this moment so many times that the body moves before the conscious mind finishes processing the information. The senior watch officer was at the communications console in under 4 seconds headset, on fingers moving across the authentication panel before the second pulse had completed. The alert was classified. Code Black, unauthorized physical interference with a POTUS security asset. Automatic trigger. No human decision required to initiate it, no confirmation needed from any individual in the chain. The vehicle's onboard system had made the determination on its own, reported it directly to the Situation Room's secure network, and the machinery of the most powerful protective apparatus on Earth had already begun moving before anyone in that room had spoken a single word. The watch officer's voice was flat and precise, stripped of everything that wasn't information. Confirm Code Black. Checkpoint Delta Colton and 7th. Overwatch 2 asset compromised. C8 authorization requested. The response from the Deputy Director of the Secret Service reached on his secure line arrived in under 90 seconds. One word: authorized. What happened next was not chaos. That was the thing that people who had never seen the Secret Service counter-assault team operate in the field always failed to understand. They imagined sirens and shouting and the frantic scrambling of people reacting to a crisis. What actually happened was the precise, terrifying opposite: the complete and utter absence of improvisation, the execution of a protocol so thoroughly rehearsed, so deeply embedded in the muscle memory of the people involved that from the outside it looked almost calm, the way things built to very high tolerances tend to look when they're operating exactly as designed. The CAT had been staged 2.1 miles from Checkpoint Delta as a standard component of the advance protocol for the evening's presidential movement through Hargrove City. They were already suited, already armed, already in their vehicles, already cycling through the final comms checks that preceded every deployment. Team leader Dutch Haverford, a broad, quiet man of 42, who had run CAT operations in 4 countries and had approximately zero interest in theater of any kind, received the Code Black alert at 5:23 p.m. At 5:24 p.m., 4 unmarked black Suburbans were moving through Hargrove City's side streets in a coordinated pattern that cut off every viable exit from the intersection of Colton and 7th simultaneously without a single unit approaching from the same direction. Back on Colton Avenue, Dale Pruitt was still standing in the middle of the street, still staring at the Suburban, still trying to construct a narrative that made sense of what he had just watched happen to a city tow truck when he heard them. He heard them before he saw them, which was itself a statement, because the sound was not the wail of standard police sirens, but something lower and more authoritative. Short, sharp bursts of federal emergency tones coming from multiple directions at once, in a way that his instincts calibrated for threats arriving from one direction at a time genuinely struggled to process. The first Suburban came around the north corner of Colton doing 40 miles an hour and stopped in a precise diagonal block across the intersection in a single fluid motion. The second mirrored it from the south. The third and fourth materialized from the cross streets on either side, completing a tight geometric perimeter around the full block, with a precision that spoke of rehearsed execution, not improvised response. The doors opened. The operators who stepped out were not dressed the way federal agents looked in movies. They were in full tactical configuration, dark plate carriers over dark fatigues helmets with mounted optics, gloved hands on short-barreled rifles held at low ready with the relaxed readiness of people who raised them for a living. They moved in pairs, spreading outward from the vehicles in overlapping arcs, establishing a hard perimeter, with the quiet, methodical precision of people who had done this in conditions considerably more hostile than a quiet Midwestern city street on a Tuesday afternoon. The small crowd of civilians who had gathered at the sound of the tow truck's destruction, the man with his phone still raised the two teenagers on their bikes, frozen at the corner. The woman with her hand to her mouth, a few others drawn by curiosity, and the particular urban instinct that something important is happening, stood very still as the perimeter materialized around them, and one by one they backed up slowly to the edge of the sidewalk, because whatever this was, it was very clearly not a situation that required their continued proximity. The man with the phone was still recording. He would not stop recording for another 8 minutes, and what he captured would reach 3 million views by midnight. Calvin Briggs, still seated on the curb next to the ruined tow truck, placed his hands more visibly on his knees, demonstrating to anyone who might be looking that he had absolutely nothing in them. Pruitt turned slowly in the center of it all, watching the perimeter close around him from 4 directions at once, and felt something he genuinely had not felt in 13 years of carrying a badge on these streets. He felt small. One of the tactical operators stopped 6 feet in front of him, visor up, rifle still down expression, carrying no anger, no excitement, and no uncertainty whatsoever. "Don't move," the operator said quietly, in the conversational tone you'd use to tell someone their meter was about to expire. It was not a request. And Pruitt did what 13 years of unchallenged authority had conditioned him to do. When he felt that authority slipping, he got loud. "Hey." He took a step forward, jabbing a finger in the man's direction. "Hey. I'm talking to you." "Who authorized this response?" "This is my scene. I have a suspect in custody and a vehicle under impound. You want to come onto my scene, you talk to me first. That's how this works." The operator he was addressing did not move, did not blink, did not adjust his grip or shift his weight or give any physical indication that Pruitt's words had registered as anything requiring a response. He simply watched Pruitt with the patient, unreadable stillness of someone trained to treat elevated voices as background noise until they became something that warranted a different category of attention. That stillness, complete professional, utterly indifferent to the performance Pruitt was giving, enraged him more than any argument could have. "I said this is my scene." Louder now. "I don't care who you people are. You don't just roll up on an active law enforcement operation without coordinating with the officer on scene. That is basic protocol, and every single one of you knows it." One of the operators near the North Suburban said something quietly into his comm. Another adjusted his position by 3 steps, closing a gap in the perimeter with the unhurried precision of someone executing a pre-planned movement rather than reacting to anything Pruitt was doing. They were not listening to him. They were categorizing him, monitoring him, managing him the way you manage a variable in an environment you have already assessed and controlled. It was the most comprehensively dismissive thing Dale Pruitt had ever experienced, and some part of him buried under the bluster understood exactly what it meant about the shift in power that had just occurred. He chose not to listen to that part. He took 2 more steps forward and dropped his hand toward his hip in the unconscious, habitual gesture of a man reaching for the authority he had always kept holstered there. The response was immediate and absolute. 3 rifles came up simultaneously, not with jerky, adrenaline-driven speed, but with the smooth, practiced economy of people, for whom raising a weapon is as natural and deliberate as standing up from a chair. 3 red laser dots appeared on Pruitt's chest in a tight cluster that did not waver by a millimeter. The man across the street, still recording, zoomed in on the 3 red dots on the police officer's chest. Pruitt froze. The ambient noise of the city traffic from the next block, a distant horn, the low idle of 4 federal Suburbans, all of it receded to the edges of his awareness, pushed out by the overwhelming singular reality of 3 rifles pointed at him by 3 people, who were calm enough in this moment to be genuinely terrifying. "Remove your hand from your weapon," the nearest operator said quietly, conversationally. "Do it slowly. Do it now." Pruitt's hand came away from his hip as though the holster had burned him. Both hands where we can see them. His hands came up to shoulder height, fingers spread the universal language of a man who has just run out of moves and knows it. And Nicholas Pruitt stood in the middle of Colton Avenue with his hands in the air and 3 federal rifles on his chest, and the man across the street still recording, and Evelyn Marsh watching from the corner, and every single thing he had used to feel like himself for 13 years gone, all at once completely in the space of a Tuesday afternoon. The rear door of the cruiser opened from the outside. Marcus Webb did not move immediately. He sat for a moment, taking in the changed geometry of the street, the perimeter, the operators, the ruined tow truck, and Dale Pruitt, standing in the center of it all with his hands raised, and the particular expression of a man whose entire understanding of his own life has just been revised without his consent. Then Marcus swung his legs out and stood. The agent who had opened the door said nothing beyond a quiet "sir," as he removed the restraints with practiced efficiency. Marcus rolled his wrists, checked the pressure marks from the 2 tight cuffs, and straightened his tactical shirt with 2 precise tugs. He retrieved his federal credential wallet, then his sidearm, checked, cleared, reholstered in one smooth motion without looking down. He looked at Pruitt. Pruitt was looking back at him. And in the 2 seconds that their eyes held across the space of that street, Marcus composed, unhurried, his sidearm back on his hip and his credential in his hand. Pruitt, with his hands still half raised and 3 laser dots having just left his chest, Pruitt understood with the complete and permanent clarity of something that cannot be unfelt exactly what he had done, and to whom, and how wrong he had been about all of it. Marcus held his gaze for those 2 seconds. His expression did not harden. It did not soften. It simply said, without any words at all, "I gave you every exit. You drove past all of them, and now we're here." Then, Marcus turned away smoothly and without drama and walked back toward the Suburban, because Dale Pruitt was no longer his problem. S.A.C. Raymond Okafor walked toward Dale Pruitt from the North Suburban with the unhurried stride of a man who has nowhere more important to be and nothing more pressing to accomplish than to stand in front of this particular officer and dismantle methodically and completely the last remaining architecture of his certainty. Okafor was 54 years old with silver beginning at his temples and a face shaped over 2 decades by the particular weather of standing between the most powerful office on earth and everything the world had ever sent against it. A face that was not angry, not impressed, not interested in performance of any kind. He wore a dark suit and a white shirt and the discreet earpiece of his trade, and he looked in the middle of all that tactical hardware and federal machinery, like the most quietly dangerous presence on the street. He moved with the unhurried precision of someone who knew the moment he was walking toward had already been decided, and that his job now was simply to deliver its full weight accurately. He stopped 3 feet from Pruitt, studied him for a moment the way a surgeon studies a scan, not with judgment, not with emotion, but with the complete clinical attention of someone taking in exactly what is there. "Officer Pruitt," he had clearly already been briefed. "My name is Special Agent in Charge Raymond Okafor. I am the detail leader for the POTUS Special Security Team currently operating in this city." He paused, letting that land. "I need you to understand some things clearly, so I'm going to speak slowly." Pruitt's hands were still partially raised. Nobody had told him he could lower them. "The vehicle you attempted to impound," Okafor continued, his voice never rising, never hardening, which was somehow considerably worse than if it had, "is a classified federal asset. A Tier 1 secure communications platform, one of 6 such vehicles deployed in this city as part of an advanced security operation for the movement of the President of the United States, who is scheduled to pass through this corridor in approximately—" He glanced at his watch with the calm of a man checking the time on a Sunday morning. 26 minutes. The color that left Pruitt's face did so completely and did not come back. "The man you detained, handcuffed, and locked in the back of your cruiser is a special operations officer with the highest security clearance available to a non-commissioned federal operative. The credential he showed you was genuine. The federal exemption plates on that vehicle are genuine. Every warning he gave you was genuine, accurate, and delivered to you in good faith at considerable personal professional restraint." Okafor tilted his head slightly. "He offered you a 60-second phone call that would have resolved every question you had. He offered it to you twice. You declined it twice. He showed you more patience than this situation required. Considerably more." Pruitt's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "When you instructed a civilian tow operator to make physical contact with that vehicle," Okafor went on, "you triggered a code-black security alert that reached the White House Situation Room within seconds. You pulled federal resources away from an active presidential protection operation. You detained a federal officer. You attempted to seize classified government property." He paused. Let the silence do its work. "And you did all of this," Okafor said quietly, "because you didn't like where the car was parked." The longest silence Dale Pruitt had ever stood inside. Okafor studied him for one final moment, then, "The President knows your name, Officer Pruitt." A beat. "Not because you impressed anyone today, because you are going to be the case study used in federal liaison training for the next decade as the definitive illustration of what catastrophically poor judgment looks like in the field." Pruitt's hands dropped to his sides. His legs appeared to be considering the same option. On the corner, Evelyn Marsh had her phone out, now held low and steady, photographing the scene. The perimeter, the federal Suburbans, the ruined tow truck, the Suburban sitting unmoved at the center of it all. She was not a journalist. She had never wanted to be a journalist. But she had spent 30 years teaching young people that documentation was not the same as accusation and that witnesses who kept records had changed the course of things before. The habits of 30 years did not unlearn themselves in retirement. She photographed what she saw. She would know what to do with it. Marcus Webb, back inside the Suburban with the door closed and the engine still idling, heard Donna's voice in his earpiece. "Overwatch 2 Checkpoint Delta is confirmed operational. T-minus 22 minutes. Excellent work." He looked through the windshield at the intersection ahead, clean monitored exactly as it needed to be. He reached for his travel mug. The coffee had gone cold. He drank it anyway. Chief Gerald Morrow's personal vehicle pulled up to the outer edge of the federal perimeter at 5:41 p.m. Without sirens, without a police escort, without the overhead lights that announce a commanding officer arriving to take charge. He had come in his personal car in his dress uniform. The combination told its own story to anyone who knew how to read it. This was not a rescue. This was a man who had been summoned to account for something one of his officers had done and who had understood somewhere on the drive over the approximate shape of what he was driving toward. He badged his way through the perimeter line. The agent who checked it did so without comment, courteous and efficient, which somehow made it worse, and stopped when he saw the ruined tow truck. Stood looking at it for a moment. Took in the 4 Federal Suburbans, the tactical perimeter the operators still positioned at their intervals, with the permanent patient quality of people who were not leaving until they decided to leave. His eyes moved to Marcus Webb standing near the armored Suburban with his credentials in hand and his expression composed, and then to Okafor, and then finally with the weight of a man arriving at something he can no longer avoid, to Dale Pruitt. Pruitt was standing exactly where Okafor had left him, hands at his sides, and the red that had drained from his face was gone, replaced by something worse. The gray, hollowed look of a man in the early stages of understanding that his life has just divided cleanly into before and after, and that everything in the after column is going to be permanently defined by what he did in the last 90 minutes. Morrow walked toward Okafor with his hand extended. "Chief Gerald Morrow. Special Agent in Charge Raymond Okafor." The handshake was brief. "I appreciate you coming quickly, Chief. I'll be direct because we're short on time." He laid it out without softening it: the detention of a federal operative, the attempted seizure of a classified presidential security asset, the triggered code black during an active protection operation, the federal charges already being prepared, interference with a protective function, unlawful detention of a federal officer, attempted seizure of classified government property. "Those charges are not coming from me. They are coming from the United States Attorney's Office notified 40 minutes ago." Morrow absorbed all of this without speaking. His jaw worked once, silently. "What I need from you right now is your cooperation in the administrative component of what happens next. Your officer's weapon and credentials need to be surrendered before he is taken into federal custody. I'm extending you the courtesy of allowing that to happen through your office, rather than having my team do it unilaterally, because I believe that matters to you, and because it's the right way to handle it. But it is happening either way." Morrow turned and looked at Pruitt. What Pruitt was looking for in that gaze, solidarity outrage on his behalf, the signal that his chief was going to step in, was not there. What was actually in Morrow's eyes was something far harder to receive than anger. It was the complete, exhausted disappointment of a man who had perhaps suspected something like this was coming for years, and who had spent those years hoping he was wrong, and who was now standing in front of the proof that he had not been wrong, and that his choice to look away had come at a cost that other people had paid. Morrow walked to Pruitt slowly. The distance between them felt longer than it was. "Dale," he said, low and private as anything could be on a street surrounded by federal agents, "give me your weapon and your badge." "Chief, I was doing my job. The plates looked wrong. The credentials looked wrong. I had no way of—" "Your weapon and your badge, Dale." Morrow's voice was steady, quiet, final. And then he said the thing that wasn't in any procedure manual. The thing that came from the 4 years of files he had chosen not to act on, and the 2 complaints he had chosen to dismiss as insufficient. There was a family in 2021, Dale. A father and his 17-year-old son on the sidewalk for 22 minutes. The boy missed his SAT. I read that complaint. I believed your account. I shouldn't have, and I knew it, and I believed it anyway. He stopped. "Give me your badge." Pruitt stared at him. Something moved behind his eyes, not anger, not argument, but the particular devastating collapse of a man realizing that even the people he thought were on his side had known, had seen, had quietly kept the score. 3 seconds of silence. Then Pruitt's hand, not entirely steady, reached across his body, unholstered his service weapon, and placed it in Morrow's outstretched hand. The badge came off next, the one he had polished that morning with the automatic pride of a man who had never imagined handing it to someone else. It sat in Morrow's palm and looked somehow smaller than it ever had before, as though the 13 years of meaning it had carried had evacuated it all at once, leaving just a piece of metal. Morrow stepped back. 2 federal agents moved forward with quiet efficiency, and Dale Pruitt's hands were drawn behind his back and secured with a zip tie in under 4 seconds. He didn't resist. There was nothing left in him to resist with. They walked him toward one of the black Suburbans with a hand on each arm. The door closed behind him with a sound that was almost gentle. Soft, unhurried. The door of a vehicle simply doing what doors do, and that gentleness, the complete indifference of it, as though what was happening to Dale Pruitt was simply a routine administrative function being completed before more important work could resume, was somehow the worst part of the whole afternoon. Because that was exactly what it was. Okafor was already back on his comm. Marcus was in the Suburban door, closed engine idling, re-establishing contact with command. Checkpoint Delta was operational, T-minus 19 minutes. Morrow stood alone in the middle of Colton Avenue, holding his officer's badge and gun, watching the federal convoy begin to move. On the corner, Evelyn Marsh's eyes met his across the distance. She didn't look away first. And in that brief held gaze between a retired schoolteacher who had been a witness on this corner for 11 years and a police chief holding a badge in his hand that he didn't know what to do with, something was communicated that had no words, something about the distance between knowing and doing and the moment when that distance finally closes and what it costs that it took this long. Morrow looked down at the badge. He made a decision. He didn't announce it. He just made it standing in the middle of a street going quiet around him and put the badge in his breast pocket and walked back to his car. With 14 minutes left on the clock, the intersection of Colton Avenue and 7th Street looked to anyone passing by almost entirely normal. The federal perimeter had pulled back to a wider, invisible ring, operators repositioned to unmarked locations 2 blocks in each direction, the visible presence of tactical hardware absorbed back into the ordinary texture of the city. The ruined tow truck still sat at the curb, hydraulics-destroyed cab, dark engine cooling a monument to something, though the people walking past it had no way of knowing what. Calvin Briggs had given a brief statement to a federal agent and arranged for a ride home. He drove away in a borrowed car and would not speak about this day for a very long time. Evelyn Marsh had moved from the corner to a bus stop bench half a block north, where she sat with her small brown dog in her lap and watched the street with the patient attention of someone who has been a witness to things before and knows how to hold that role without making it about herself. She had taken 22 photographs on her phone. She had not posted them anywhere yet and would not until she understood what was appropriate to do with them. The man who had been recording on his phone across the street had sent the video to a number he had saved in his phone under "cousin who works at the news." He was not entirely sure why he had saved it there, except that you never knew when something like that would matter. In the Suburban, Marcus had re-established full contact with command, confirmed Checkpoint Delta's operational status, and settled back into the quiet readiness that was the primary texture of this work. He reached for the travel mug. Still cold. He drank it anyway, his eyes moving in their slow, methodical sweep across the intersection ahead. T-minus 7 minutes, Overwatch 2. Package is mobile. Overwatch 2 copies. Checkpoint Delta is clean. The motorcade passed through the intersection of Colton and 7th at 5:53 p.m. To the handful of civilians on the sidewalk, at that moment, it was a tight cluster of dark vehicles moving with quiet purpose through an intersection on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday evening. It was over in less than 40 seconds. Nothing announced it. The vehicles simply passed and then were gone, and the intersection returned to itself. That was exactly the point, and it was the point Marcus had been holding this checkpoint for. "Package secure," Donna said in his ear. "Checkpoint Delta clear. Operation complete. Excellent work, Overwatch 2. You really held it together out there. There was warmth in that last sentence barely there, the kind only 6 years of working together made audible, and Marcus acknowledged it with the quietest possible exhale, the operational equivalent of accepting a compliment without making it larger than it was. He set the travel mug down, put the Suburban in drive, and pulled out of the loading zone on Colton Avenue. He thought on the drive about his mother. He thought about her in the way he often did after operations that had gone sideways, and then right again, not sentimentally, not with the kind of emotion that needed somewhere to go, but with the particular quiet gratitude of a man who had been taught, by watching someone he loved do hard and invisible work without complaint, that the value of a thing is not determined by whether anyone is watching. His mother had cleaned office buildings for 22 years so that he could go to school and earn things, and the earning was the point, and the fact that those buildings had all been cleaned by the time the people who worked in them arrived every morning. The fact of that thoroughness, that work done right in the dark, was something he had carried with him into every checkpoint, in every city, in every year of this career, without ever putting it into words. He was very good at being invisible. He had learned it from her. On the corner of Colton and 7th Evelyn Marsh, watched the last of the federal vehicles clear the perimeter and disperse back into the city's traffic. She sat for a moment longer with her dog warm in her lap and the photographs on her phone, and thought about what she'd watched unfold over the last hour and a half. The man in the loading zone, the officer who'd knocked on his window, the tow truck, the federal vehicles closing in from 4 directions, the badge being handed over in the afternoon light, the look Chief Morrow had given her across the street. She had been a witness to things in 30 years of teaching, had watched brilliant students miss opportunities because of the particular compounding weight of being seen wrong by someone with authority over them, had watched institutions fail the people they were supposed to serve, and then file the failure away and call it resolved. She was not surprised by what she had seen today. She was tired of not being surprised by it. She had photographs now. She had been a witness. She had a contact at the local paper who covered city affairs with the dogged, underpaid thoroughness of someone who still believed the work mattered. She stood up, tucked the dog under her arm, and walked home through the golden hour light, and the intersection of Colton and 7th went quiet behind her, carrying all of it forward in the way cities carry everything invisibly, without comment in the daily accumulation of what people do and don't do to each other, in the spaces between the things that make the news. The federal processing facility where Dale Pruitt was taken that evening operated by a different set of rules than the ones he had spent 13 years applying, and the difference announced itself immediately and completely in a way that left no room for reinterpretation. No one here knew him. No one here owed him a favor or a coffee or the professional deference that came from sharing a break room and a shift schedule and the unspoken understanding that you covered for each other because someday the covering might go the other direction. No one here was impressed by 13 years at Hargrove PD. No one here had any investment whatsoever in the story Dale Pruitt had always told about himself, and the absence of that audience, of the specific familiar audience that had always been there to receive and validate the performance, was its own kind of stripping away, quiet and total, before a single item had been placed in a plastic bin. His service weapon already surrendered. His badge already surrendered. Now it was his wallet, his phone, his belt, his watch, his shoelaces, each item catalogued by a federal intake officer who moved through the procedure with the impartial efficiency of someone who processed people. The way accountants process numbers without personal investment in the content. His clothes were exchanged for a temporary holding uniform that fit him the way borrowed clothes always fit, close enough to wear, wrong enough to remind you constantly that they aren't yours. The man who had polished his boots that morning with the automatic, unthinking pride of a man who had never imagined a morning when he wouldn't put them back on stood in socks on a federal processing floor. He was allowed one phone call. He called Sal Ferrigno, the police union representative, who had been pulling Hargrove PD officers back from the edge of serious consequence for 20 years, a compact, pragmatic man who had seen enough situations to know how to read one over the phone in under 60 seconds. Sal picked up on the second ring, listened to Pruitt's account with focused, uninterruptible attention, and was silent for a moment when Pruitt finished. Then, "Dale, was there a recording?" "What recording?" "Of the stop, of the credential exchange, of you calling the tow truck." The silence on Pruitt's end was its own answer, and they both understood that. "I'm going to need you to listen to me carefully," Sal said. His voice was not unkind. It had the particular tone of someone delivering information that is honest rather than comforting, because he had learned over 20 years that comfort at the expense of honesty didn't actually serve the people he was representing, it just delayed things. "The charges you're facing are federal. My jurisdiction is local. There is a ceiling on what the union can do here, and it is low." He told Pruitt the rest, the precinct's federal liaison. The specific named contact whose number had been on a laminated card in Pruitt's own cruiser for 2 years had confirmed to the investigating team that a call from Pruitt at any point during the stop would have produced a full verification of the Suburban's status in under 60 seconds. There was a recording from an exterior microphone array on the vehicle itself. The U.S. Attorney's Office had been notified and was reviewing the incident for additional violations beyond the immediate federal charges. "Dale, you had an off-ramp," Sal said. "You drove past it, more than once by the sound of it. I can find you a good attorney, but this is federal. There is a recording and the president's office was notified, and there's something else." A pause. "I've been getting calls about you for 4 years. Complaints. I defended you every time. Every single time, Dale. I told myself you were a good cop having bad judgment calls." His voice went flat. "I'm done telling myself that. Get an attorney." He hung up. The holding cell was 8 by 10. Concrete walls, a narrow bunk, fluorescent light that ran continuously and did not dim and did not care what time it was. The smell of institutional cleaning solution layered over something older and less definable. No badge, no cruiser, no patrol zone, no audience for the performances that had constituted for 13 years the architecture of his identity. Just the bunk and the light, and a silence that had nothing in it except time. He lay down, stared at the ceiling, and for the first time not rushed, not interrupted, not able to redirect his attention toward the next thing that needed asserting. He replayed the stop from the beginning with the unhurried compulsory clarity that comes to a person when there is nowhere else to go. The plates, the flag that came back in 4 seconds. The credential wallet mat, black the gold seal, the specific federal typeface that he had looked at for 2 seconds and dismissed with a sound through his nose. The calm, steady voice offering the DHS verification line. The 60-second confirmation waiting at the other end of a phone call he had never made. "You people always gotta make it complicated, don't you?" He had said that. Out loud, with a federal microphone on the vehicle recording every word. He lay there with all of it and felt slowly the particular sensation of a person who has been wrong about something important for a long time and is encountering for the first time the full, unmodified shape of that wrongness without anyone around to help him manage it. 3 miles away in a federal field office that smelled of printer cartridges and hours-old coffee, Agent Donna Reeves was completing the upload of the Suburban's exterior microphone array, recording 23 minutes of clean, clear audio that began with 3 sharp knocks on a window and ended with the sound of a cruiser door closing and forwarding it to 6 addresses simultaneously. The recording was very clear. "You people always gotta make it complicated, don't you?" It was going to be very clear in court, too. Chief Gerald Morrow returned to the Hargrove City Police Department at 7:14 p.m., changed out of his dress uniform in his office without turning on the overhead light, and sat down in front of his computer in the blue-white glow of the monitor. He opened the Internal Affairs filing system, navigated to the complaints archive, entered Dale Pruitt's badge number, and sat back and let the screen load. He had known in the peripheral way that a chief knows things that haven't crossed the threshold of requiring his direct attention, that Pruitt had accumulated complaints over the years, information that lived in the background of his awareness, noted and not actioned, filed under the category of officers whose edges were rough but whose numbers were fine, and who hadn't given him anything so definitive that it demanded a reckoning. He had told himself at various points in the last 4 years that complaints were not the same as findings, that allegations weren't guilt, that aggressive enforcement was not the same as discriminatory enforcement, and that the texture of Pruitt's record didn't constitute the kind of pattern that required him to do something harder than filing and moving on. The filing system disagreed with that reading, now that he was actually sitting with it in full, without the rush of daily operations softening the cumulative picture. 2019, a black man, 34, had filed a complaint after his vehicle was impounded from a metered zone on Ashworth Street. The technical violation expired meter 17 minutes over was accurate. The vehicle 3 spaces ahead of his, registered to a white resident in the same zone, had been over by 23 minutes. Pruitt had not touched that one. Complaint filed as insufficient evidence of discriminatory intent. 2021, a family complaint. A black father and his 17-year-old son pulled over on Meridian Avenue at 8:40 a.m. on a Saturday in October. After a records check that came back entirely clean, both of them were placed on the sidewalk for 22 minutes, cuffed in full view of the neighborhood. The son had been on his way to his SAT exam at Lincoln High School that morning. He missed it. The letter the family subsequently wrote to the college board requesting accommodation had not been successful. The complaint had been reviewed by Morrow himself, filed as unfounded. 2023. An engineering student, 21. Black, his car towed from a loading zone on Colton Avenue on a Thursday morning in March. Morrow pulled the enforcement records for that zone in the 6 months surrounding the tow. He found 4 other instances of vehicles parked in the same zone for equal or longer durations that received only a warning notice. All 4 were registered to white residents. The engineering student had missed the morning his car was towed, a final interview for a competitive internship that his university advisor described as the kind of opportunity that does not typically come twice. Complaint filed as officer used appropriate discretion. But it was when Morrow dug deeper, when he pulled records that weren't in the complaints file, but in the internal case management system, that the picture became something he could no longer call insufficient. In 2022, a black resident named Raymond Fuller had filed a formal grievance alleging that Pruitt had deliberately withheld exculpatory evidence in a minor possession case. A piece of footage from a nearby store camera that would have placed Fuller a full block away from the reported incident at the time it occurred. The footage had disappeared from the evidence log. Pruitt's explanation was that it had never been collected. The store owner had a different recollection. The case had been reviewed by the department's Internal Affairs unit, a unit that Morrow now noted with a specific and uncomfortable recognition had been headed at the time by a captain who had since retired, but who had also been one of the officers most likely to be found in conversation with Pruitt over a cup of free coffee at the corner store. The case was closed. Raymond Fuller had served 45 days. Morrow sat with that one for a long time. He opened a new document and began writing a formal referral to the City of Hargrove's Office of Professional Standards, requesting a full review of all complaints filed against Officer Dale Pruitt over the preceding 4 years, with particular attention to patterns in enforcement against black residents, and the 2022 evidence handling incident. He noted his own prior reviews of the 2021 and 2023 complaints and the disposition he had given them. He did not soften that last part. He sent the referral at 8:52 p.m. and sat back in his chair in the dark office. Across town, Agent Donna Reeves was coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's team, and the federal picture was developing its own dimensions. The Code Black alone guaranteed the 3 initial charges, but the U.S. Attorney's Office, having received both the incident report and the full audio recording and having read, "You people always gotta make it complicated, don't you?" in the transcript had requested something broader, a review of Pruitt's full enforcement history for evidence of a pattern of civil rights violations, the kind of broad, deep review that began with data and ended with indictments. Donna pulled 4 years of traffic stop data from Hargrove PD's record system under federal subpoena processed in under 2 hours, because federal subpoenas in Code Black cases moved quickly, and began the analysis that would in the weeks ahead form the statistical backbone of the 4th charge. In Pruitt's patrol zone, black male drivers were stopped and cited at rates that did not reflect the demographic composition of the driving population. Impounds were applied with a selectivity that was not random. Pretextual violations appeared in Pruitt's record at a frequency and in a direction that, taken together, told a story that each individual incident could be explained away from, but that refused in aggregate to be explained. The findings were not surprising to anyone who had driven in Pruitt's zone while black. They were, however, now documented, with federal precision, in a format that would be submitted to a federal court, reviewed by a federal judge, and placed permanently into a public record where it could not be filed away or called insufficient or given the benefit of a doubt that had never been distributed evenly. Marcus gave his deposition the following morning in a conference room that smelled of recycled air and institutional coffee, providing his account with the comprehensive, sequential precision of a man who had debriefed under pressure before and who understood that the value of testimony lay entirely in its accuracy and nothing else. At the end, one of the federal attorneys looked up from her notes and asked, "At any point during the encounter in your professional assessment, did you believe Officer Pruitt's conduct was motivated by the nature of your credentials or by something else?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "He made his determination before he left his cruiser," Marcus said. "Everything after that was confirmation. He was not looking for information. He was looking for a way to make what he had already decided look procedural." A pause. The words he used during the pat-down removed any remaining ambiguity about his motivation. The attorney wrote something down and underlined it. Evelyn Marsh called the Hargrove City Courier that same morning and asked to speak with the reporter who covered City Hall, a 29-year-old woman named Jess Calloway, who covered the municipal beat with the dogged, underpaid commitment of someone who had gotten into journalism because she still believed unfashionably that it mattered who knew what and when. Evelyn told her she had been a witness to a federal action at Colton and 7th involving a Hargrove police officer, and that she had photographs, and that she had been watching this corner for 11 years and had things to say about what she had seen over those 11 years. Calloway came to her apartment the next morning with a recorder and a notebook. Evelyn made tea. Then she talked for 2 hours clearly and specifically, and what she said was the kind of testimony that a good reporter does not hear very often. Not allegation, not grievance, unmoored from fact, but the account of a trained observer who kept the two categories rigorously separate and who knew from 30 years of teaching young people to pay attention exactly how to make the distinction visible. Calloway filed the story 48 hours later. The headline in the Hargrove City Courier ran on a Thursday morning at the top of the digital front page above a photograph Evelyn Marsh had taken from the corner of Colton and 7th, the ruined tow truck at the curb, one of the federal Suburbans visible at the edge of the frame, the street quiet and still in the late afternoon light. Hargrove officer arrested by Secret Service after attempting to impound presidential security vehicle pattern of selective enforcement among allegations. By 11 a.m., 3 national outlets had picked up the story. By 2 p.m., the video taken by the man across the street, the full 8 minutes including the 3 red laser dots on the chest of a Hargrove City police officer, had 3 million views on social media. By evening, the audio excerpt that the U.S. Attorney's Office had authorized for release specifically the moment Marcus offered the DHS verification line. Then the 30 seconds of, "You people always gotta make it complicated, don't you?" was being shared by people who had never heard of Hargrove City and who were sharing it not because of the federal dimensions of the incident, but because those specific seconds of audio were the kind of thing that required no explanation, no context, no editorial framing whatsoever. In the neighborhood where Pruitt had patrolled for 13 years, the reaction was not surprise. It was the particular complicated exhale of people who have known something to be true for a long time and have not been believed or have not been listened to or have had their knowing dismissed as insufficient, and who are now watching the thing they knew become officially true, in a format that the people who had dismissed them would have to engage with. Not celebration. The situation was not a celebration, and the people who had been on the receiving end of Pruitt's enforcement for 13 years knew better than to mistake documentation for justice, knew that documentation was just the precondition for what came after. But something, yes. Some release of a pressure that had been building for a long time. The father from the 2021 stop was 57 years old now and had a routine of reading the news on his phone during breakfast before his shift at the distribution center where he worked. He saw the story on a Thursday morning with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, and he sat very still for a long moment, long enough that his wife came in from the kitchen and asked if he was all right. He told her what the story was. Their son, 21 now, a junior at the state university studying civil engineering, doing fine fighting harder than he should have had to fight to get there, was in a study hall when the story broke phone face down per his own rule. When he flipped it over at the break, he had 11 text messages. He read the story standing in the hallway outside the library. He stood there for a while, long enough that a classmate asked him if he was okay. He said he was. He went back inside and sat down and tried to do the work. The 2023 engineering student, 23, now working at a firm in Cincinnati on a community center renovation project that had been on his desk for 6 months, saw the story in the evening and called his mother from his apartment. And she cried a little, and he told her not to, and she cried anyway, and he let her. And after a while they talked about something else. At the Hargrove City Police Department, the story landed into a building that had been bracing for something since the previous evening's alerts. Officers who had shared Pruitt's worldview went quiet in the particular way that people go quiet when the thing they've been implicitly endorsing by not opposing becomes visible and undeniable. Officers who had quietly avoided his orbit, who had seen what he was and told themselves it wasn't their problem, or wasn't their lane, or wasn't provably what it looked like, felt the weight of that avoidance more acutely now that it had a price tag attached to it that everyone could read. 2 officers who had given statements during the reviews of the 2021 and 2023 complaint statements that had supported Pruitt's version of events contacted the federal investigation team independently within 24 hours of the story running. They wanted to amend their statements. The federal team received both calls and noted in the investigative file the specific timing. Chief Morrow held a press conference at 3 p.m. that Thursday. He stood at the podium without notes. He did not begin with, "Our department takes these allegations very seriously," and both choices were noticed by the reporters in the room who had heard the other version many times. "We failed people who came to us," Morrow said, standing in front of the Hargrove PD seal. "Not this department as an abstraction, I failed them. I reviewed complaints that were telling me something I didn't act on, and I am responsible for that, and I intend to say so clearly, rather than in language that softens it." He announced the Office of Professional Standards referral. The internal review of all complaints filed against Pruitt over 4 years, the review of the 2022 evidence handling incident, and a new mandatory protocol for federal liaison verification in any stop involving government-plated vehicles to be implemented within 30 days. He said these things would not undo what had already been done to the people who had filed those complaints, and he said it directly without hedging it, which meant the reporters wrote it down. It was not enough. It was not nothing. Marcus Webb watched the press conference from a hotel room on the other side of Hargrove City, sound low, sitting on the edge of the bed with his jacket off. He watched Morrow at the podium, watched the reporters' hands moving across their notebooks, watched the Hargrove PD seal in the background with the particular attention of a man who has seen a lot of institutions try to respond to accountability, and who knows the difference between the performance of it and the beginning of the actual thing. He saw Evelyn Marsh's name in the caption beneath the reporter's stand-up piece. He thought about her on the corner. Still, watching, filing it away. He thought about what it costs not physically, but in the accumulated way of a person who has watched things happen in her neighborhood for 11 years and has had to decide each time whether to carry the weight of witnessing or put it down and walk away. She had not put it down. He closed the laptop, called his mother in North Philadelphia. She answered on the second ring. He didn't tell her what had happened. He never told her the specifics, but she asked how he was, and he said he was fine. And she said, "You sound tired." And he said he was a little, and she said, "Come home soon." And he said he would. And he meant it more than he usually did. In federal holding, Dale Pruitt was brought a printed copy of the Courier story by his court-appointed attorney, who had reviewed the file and arrived at a frank professional assessment of what they were working with. Pruitt read the story slowly in the manner of a man encountering his own life, as described by someone who is not him, finding the dissonance between the version on the page and the version he had always carried inside. When he reached the audio transcript, "You people always gotta make it complicated, don't you?" He set the paper face down on the table, sat with that for a while, then picked it up again, turned it back over, and kept reading. Because the story wasn't going to change by being face down on a table, and some part of him, some small, newly cracked open part that had not existed before the fluorescent light of a federal holding cell, and a silence with nothing in it but time, understood that reading it without flinching was perhaps the first honest thing he had done in a very long time. The Federal District Courthouse in Hargrove City was not a building that rewarded drama. Its architecture was the architecture of consequence rather than theater-long corridors of polished marble, heavy oak paneling that had absorbed decades of difficult things being said and decided in rooms off its hallways, the particular weight of a building that had been used over the years for exactly the purpose it was designed for. Courtroom 4B, where the trial of former Hargrove City police officer Dale Pruitt opened on a Wednesday morning 4 months after the incident on Colton Avenue, was full, in a way that federal criminal trials in mid-size Midwestern cities were not typically full. The gallery behind the bar was seated to capacity since the doors opened. Among the people sitting in it were Evelyn Marsh, third-row center, straight-backed hands folded in her lap, wearing the same quiet, composed attention she brought to everything she decided to witness. The father from the 2021 stopped 2 rows, back his hands flat on his thighs, his wife beside him. The engineering student from 2023, who had driven up from Cincinnati the evening before and had found a place to park without incident 3 blocks from the courthouse. At the defense table, Dale Pruitt sat in a gray suit purchased for this trial, and it fit him differently than his uniform had ever fit him, because the physical structure that the uniform had expressed the breadth of a man who wore authority like a second skeleton had diminished over 4 months in a way that no suit could compensate for. He had lost weight. His face had changed in the specific way that faces change when the animating certainty that used to occupy them has been replaced by something more uncertain and less comfortable. He did not look at the gallery. The table in front of him was as good a focus point as any. Federal Prosecutor Claire Voss, careful, thorough 38 with the professional confidence that comes from a decade of doing the hard, unglamorous work of building cases rather than performing them, called Marcus Webb as her first witness. He came through the rear door of the courtroom in his dress uniform. The gallery went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when a person enters them carrying something more substantial than their physical presence. Marcus moved down the center aisle with the same controlled, deliberate ease that had characterized everything he had done. On Colton Avenue 4 months ago, took the oath and settled into the witness chair with his back straight and his hands on his thighs and his expression exactly as composed as it had been behind 2 inches of tinted glass when Dale Pruitt's flashlight had first tapped on the window. Voss took him through the incident methodically, the checkpoint assignment, the time and location. The first sight of Pruitt's cruiser, the knock on the window, the credential exchange, the offer of the DHS verification line, the response to that offer, the pat-down, the cuffs, the specific words Pruitt had used during the search. Marcus answered each question with the precision of someone who understood that the value of testimony lay entirely in its accuracy, and whose accuracy was in this case total, because he had recalled these events in the same order, in the same detail, in every telling since the debrief the following morning, and the story had not changed by a single word. The jury watched him with the specific quality of attention that people give to a person they have decided in the first minutes to believe. On cross-examination, David Holst Pruitt's court-appointed attorney, a man doing his professional best with very limited materials, attempted carefully and without much apparent hope, the argument that Marcus's conduct during the stop might have been experienced by a responding officer as something less than fully cooperative. The credential presentation through a 2-inch gap wasn't that somewhat unconventional. The refusal to step out immediately, couldn't a reasonable officer interpret that as non-compliance? Marcus listened to each question with patient, measuring attention. I lowered the window 2 inches because that is the controlled engagement protocol for this vehicle under active operational conditions. I did not step out immediately because I first made a documented attempt to resolve the situation through the federal liaison verification process, which I offered him the specific procedure to complete. When that offer was declined, I requested authorization from my command to disclose operational status. When that authorization was also denied, I stepped out. I was never non-compliant. I was careful. Holst tried from a different angle. You can't actually know what motivated Officer Pruitt's actions. You can only report what you observed. I know that he ran the plates and received a federal exemption flag in under 4 seconds and explicitly told me he didn't care what it said. I know that I offered him a 60-second phone call that would have resolved every question he had, and he declined it. I know that when he looked at the credential I showed him, he looked at it for 2 seconds and said it looked like a Halloween prop. I know what he said to me while he conducted the search. Marcus paused. I can only report what I observed. What I observed was a man who had made his decision before he left his cruiser and who was constructing a procedure around a conclusion rather than reaching a conclusion from a procedure. The words he used while searching me confirmed the nature of that conclusion. Holst sat down. The 2021 father took the stand in the afternoon session. 57 years old, with a quiet, careful way of speaking, shaped by years of having to be very precise about things, because imprecision had a way of being used against you. He described the stop on Meridian Avenue, the registration sticker his son beside him, the 22 minutes on the sidewalk, the records check that came back entirely clean, because there was nothing to find. The SAT exam his son had been on his way to when the lights came on behind them. He was not theatrical. He was not performing grief or anger. He was simply clear and specific and tired in the way that people get tired when they have been carrying something for 4 years they didn't ask to carry. He said what happened and what it cost. And he sat down. The engineering student testified the following morning, 23 now. A career going well, the kind of career that had cost him considerably more effort to achieve than it should have, and he talked about the impound, and the interview he hadn't made and the internship he hadn't gotten, and he talked about it without self-pity, which was its own kind of devastating because it meant the audience was not being asked to feel sorry for him, but to understand that something wrong had happened to a person who had handled it well and who was telling them about it now, because getting past something is not the same as it not having happened. Evelyn Marsh testified on the third day. 14 minutes. She described what she had seen on Colton Avenue with the methodical, unhurried precision of a woman who had spent 30 years teaching young people to separate what they observed from what they interpreted, and who applied that discipline to her own testimony with the rigor she had always demanded of her students. She described the knock the credential held up the dismissal, the tow truck's arrival, the anchor system engaging the federal vehicles arriving from 4 directions, the badge surrendered in the afternoon light, the look Chief Morrow had given her across the street. She did not tell the jury what it meant. She told them what she saw. They were intelligent adults who could understand what it meant. The prosecution played the audio recording in its entirety. The courtroom was very still as the recording ran 3 sharp knocks on glass. The credential exchanged the offer of the verification line, the flashlight on the roof, and then, during the pat-down in Pruitt's voice, clear and fully audible and carrying a particular casual confidence of a man who believes he is not being heard. "You people always gotta make it complicated, don't you? Always got some story. Always got something fancy in your pocket." Nobody in the gallery moved. Pruitt sat at the defense table and stared at the wood in front of him. The jury returned a verdict on a Friday afternoon, guilty on all 4 counts. The gallery was quiet in the aftermath, not the quiet of an audience waiting for something else, but the quiet of people who have arrived at the end of something and are sitting with the particular complicated weight of a conclusion that is right and that cost too much to be entirely satisfying. The 2021 father sat with his hands flat on his thighs for a long moment before he stood. The engineering student looked at his hands in his lap. Evelyn Marsh sat straight-backed and still, as she had sat for 3 days, and her face said what it had said throughout, that she had known and had witnessed and had done what a witness does, and that now the thing had been decided. Pruitt stared at the table. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later in the same courtroom. The Honorable Judge Loretta Branigan presided over federal criminal cases with the gravity that accumulated when you had spent 14 years on the bench, specifically because of your record on civil rights cases and public corruption, and that had deepened over those 14 years into something that filled a room before she spoke. She was 62 years old, black, with a measured deliberateness in everything she did that said this was not a person who wasted motion or sound. She ordered Pruitt to stand. He stood. The marshal beside him was present but not needed. His legs were working barely the legs of a man who had been informed of the sentencing guidelines and had spent 2 weeks in the particular internal weather of that knowledge. His hands were folded in front of him, and they were not entirely still. Judge Branigan was quiet for a moment after he rose. The full courtroom matched her silence. "Mr. Pruitt," her voice was measured and even, filling the room without effort. "You were given a badge and a sworn oath and a firearm and the extraordinary authority to deprive your fellow citizens of their liberty in the name of the public safety you were trusted to protect. That is not a small thing. That is among the most significant grants of power that a democratic government extends to an individual. And it comes with a commensurately serious obligation not merely to the law as written, but to the equal impartial spirit of its application." Pruitt's eyes were on the floor. "On the immediate charges, you interfered with a federal security operation protecting the President of the United States. You detained and handcuffed a federal officer who provided you on multiple occasions with the precise procedure required to verify his credentials, and you declined to use it. You caused the triggering of an emergency protocol that drew federal resources away from an active presidential protection detail. These facts are established by your own recorded behavior." She paused. "Let that settle." But I want to address the fourth count because it speaks to something larger than a single afternoon on Colton Avenue, and because this court believes that larger thing deserves to be named directly. The courtroom was very still. Over 4 years in the patrol zone, you were trusted to serve equitably. You applied the law selectively, not chaotically, selectively, and consistently, in a direction that is documented and inescapable in its meaning. A young man missed a college entrance exam because you chose to make a 22-minute demonstration of authority out of a registration sticker. An engineering student missed a career-defining interview because you chose to impound his car from a zone you declined to enforce against others. A man named Raymond Fuller served 45 days because you made evidence disappear. These are not isolated moments of poor judgment. They are the texture of how you exercised power over years, and the people who received the unequal application of that power have carried the cost of it in ways that no restitution order fully addresses. Pruitt's jaw tightened, a single muscle visible and controlled. "You did not make a mistake in judgment, Mr. Pruitt." Judge Brannigan's voice was level and absolute. "You revealed your judgment. A mistake is a departure from what you actually believe and intend. What happened on Colton Avenue? What happened to that family in 2021? What happened to that student in 2023? What happened to Raymond Fuller? That was not a departure. That was a continuation. And it continued for 13 years because every institution that should have stopped it, including the department he served, chose at various points and for various reasons to look away. She let that land. Her eyes moved to Chief Morrow, who was seated in the gallery as he had been for every day of the trial. He did not look away. What this court can do is ensure that the official record reflects clearly and permanently what was done and what it cost. And what this court can do is make certain that the sentence imposed today leaves no doubt about how seriously the federal system regards the abuse of the power it entrusts to the people who carry a badge. On the federal charges of interference with a protective function, unlawful detention of a federal officer, and attempted seizure of classified government property, I sentence you to 36 months in federal custody. On the count of civil rights violations under 18 United States Code. Section 242 reflecting 4 years multiple victims and the additional evidence tampering finding, I sentence you to an additional 24 months. She squared the sentencing document on the bench. Total sentence 60 months federal custody. No early release eligibility for the first 36 months. Mandatory federal supervision for 5 years post-release. Permanent prohibition from serving in any law enforcement capacity in any jurisdiction in the United States. Full financial restitution to the parties identified in the civil rights finding. The restitution to Mr. Fuller will be calculated separately and submitted to this court within 60 days. She raised her gavel. May the record reflect that this court finds the sentence appropriate to both the conduct and its full context. The gavel came down. In the gallery, the sound of it moved through the people sitting there in different ways through the 2021 Father as something releasing very slowly, like air from something sealed too long. Through the engineering student as something he would need time to feel the full shape of. Through Evelyn Marsh as the confirmation of something she had known would come if enough people did their jobs. As the marshals approached Pruitt, he turned once to look at the gallery. His eyes found the 2021 Father. The Father looked back at him without hatred, without satisfaction, without performance of any kind, just the steady, watchful gaze of a man whose son was in his junior year of college studying civil engineering, and whose son was going to finish, and whose son had already told his father over the phone last week about the project he wanted to do after graduation, designing affordable housing for the North Hargrove neighborhood, the neighborhood he had grown up in, the neighborhood where a registration sticker had once cost him a morning and a year of harder fighting than should have been necessary to get back to where he was going anyway. Pruitt held that gaze for a moment. Then he looked away. The marshals walked him toward the door that led to holding, and the door closed behind him, with the sound of a door closing, ordinary, unhurried, complete. 1 year after the incident on Colton Avenue, the intersection of Colton and 7th in Hargrove City looked in most respects exactly as it always had. The loading zone was marked with a fresh yellow line. The hardware store on the corner had a new awning. The coffee shop across the street had put out sidewalk seating for the warm months. The tow truck was long gone. Calvin Briggs's company had it towed by a competitor. The insurance claim had been complex and unpleasant, and the whole thing had produced a revision to the municipal contract for government vehicle towing, requiring federal liaison verification before any government-plated vehicle could be removed by a civilian operator. That revision had cost someone in the city attorney's office 4 weeks and had saved, by the estimate of the Federal Liaison Office, approximately the amount of trouble that the original incident had caused, which was significant. Evelyn Marsh still walked her dog on this block every morning. She had testified in federal court. She had been cited in the federal opinion as a material witness whose account contributed substantially to the civil rights pattern finding. She had been invited to speak at a professional standards conference for law enforcement departments in 3 states, and she had done it with the same methodical clarity she brought to everything, telling the officers in those rooms what it looked like from the sidewalk, not as accusation, not as indictment, but as the account of a witness who had stood there for 11 years and thought they deserved to know. Some of them had listened in the specific, effortful way that people listen when they are hearing something they would prefer not to believe, but cannot find a reason to dismiss. She walked home afterward and made a cup of tea and called her daughter in Atlanta, and that was enough. She meant that without irony or diminishment. It genuinely was. Chief Gerald Morrow's internal review had taken 6 months and produced concrete action rather than the kind of report that sits in a filing system alongside the complaints that prompted it. 3 officers with enforcement patterns resembling Pruitt's were placed on supervised practice with mandatory retraining. 2 were separated from the department, one by termination following a formal hearing, one by resignation, that came before the hearing was scheduled, which Morrow recorded in the file without comment. The 2022 evidence tampering finding was referred to the district attorney's office. A former internal affairs captain by then, retired on his pension, received a target letter the following spring. The Office of Professional Standards, newly funded and staffed with an independent director who reported to the city council rather than the police chief, cleared a backlog of 47 complaints previously filed as insufficient or unsubstantiated. 11 produced formal disciplinary findings. Raymond Fuller, whose 45 days had been served 4 years ago and could not be given back, received a formal letter of acknowledgement from the city attorney's office and a restitution check that he told his wife wasn't enough and that she said was at least something, and that they both agreed was not justice, but was finally the official record saying what the unofficial record had always known. None of this undid what had been done to the people who had filed the original complaints. The 2021 son had still missed his SAT. The 2023 student had still missed his interview. 45 days of Raymond Fuller's life were gone and would stay gone regardless of what any letter said. The honest truth of institutional repair is that it happens in a different register from the harm itself. It closes the open pipes, it changes the architecture going forward, but it does not reach back into the lives of the people who bore the cost and make them whole. That was the honest truth of it, and Morrow had stopped telling himself a more comfortable version. The 2021 son graduated in May. His parents drove up for the ceremony, his father in the same suit he had worn to the federal courthouse, and his mother in the blue dress she had been saving for something worth saving it for, and they sat in the bleachers of a university they had driven past for years on the way to things that cost less and meant less, and watched their son walk across a stage in a cap and gown. He was studying civil engineering. He had already told his father on the phone the week before graduation about what he wanted to do with it, affordable housing design in North Hargrove, the neighborhood he had grown up in. the neighborhood that had shaped him and that he intended to reshape in return. The neighborhood where a Saturday morning and a registration sticker had once cost him a year of harder fighting than should have been necessary to get to where he was always going to get anyway. His father had listened to all of this and then been quiet for a moment. "You're going to build things," he had finally said, and there wasn't anything else to say after that. The engineering student from 2023 had been promoted at his firm. He was working on a community center renovation in Cincinnati, a project that had been on his desk for 6 months, and that would, when it was finished, be used by people who would have no way of knowing what it had cost any particular person to get to the point where they could work on it. He didn't need them to know. The work was the point. Dale Pruitt was serving his sentence at a federal minimum security facility in southern Ohio. He had no badge, no cruiser, no patrol zone, no audience. He worked on the facility's grounds maintenance crew up at 5:30 meals at scheduled times movement, governed by other people's rules. The specific inversion of that of being the one whose movements were controlled, whose compliance was monitored, whose choices were bounded by authority. He had no part in making, was something he had needed considerable time to adjust to, and had adjusted to, in the way that people adjust to things that are not going to change, which is not the same as making peace with them. He had submitted through his case manager a written application to contact the Federal Restitution Coordinator for each of the identified parties, the 2021 family, the 2023 student, Raymond Fuller. The applications required written statements of purpose reviewed by a federal advocate, with participation entirely at the discretion of the parties themselves. The 2021 family had declined. That was their right, and it was exercised completely. Raymond Fuller had not yet responded. His case manager said that was not unusual, and that the process sometimes took a long time. The engineering student from 2023 had sent back a single written sentence. "I don't have anything to say to you, but I want you to know. I'm doing fine." Pruitt had read that sentence several times in the fluorescent light of his cell. He had not been able to explain even to himself precisely why it was harder to receive than a refusal would have been, why the simple, quiet declaration of "I'm doing fine" from a person he had wronged and who owed him absolutely nothing carried more weight than any verdict or any sentence. He had folded the paper carefully and put it in the small cardboard box where he kept the things that were his. Marcus Webb had been back on advance work for 11 months. He had accepted the promotion team leader with the modification that he would continue doing checkpoint operations rather than moving fully into the supervisory desk role. He had been at checkpoints in 4 cities since Hargrove. He had sat in loading zones and watched intersections and run the clock down to POTUS movement with the same methodical, invisible patience that he had always brought to this work, and each time it had been clean, and each time the package had been secure, and each time Donna's voice in his earpiece had confirmed completion, and he had felt in that confirmation the quiet satisfaction of work done right in the dark where no one would ever know it had been done. He called his mother more often now. The frequency of the calls had shifted in the months after Hargrove. Without him announcing the shift or explaining it, it had just happened, as though something in him had recalibrated toward the things that mattered in a way that expressed itself in phone calls rather than words. She still told him to come home soon. He was getting better at actually doing it. One evening in November, driving back from a site debrief through a part of a city, he didn't know well, he passed a corner where an older woman was walking a small dog in the thin blue light of early winter. The way she walked, the particular quality of her stillness, the attentive, unhurried way she moved through the block as though every detail of it mattered, made him slow without thinking about it. It wasn't Evelyn Marsh. It was a stranger he didn't know going about the ordinary work of her evening. He kept driving. But he thought about Evelyn Marsh for a long time on the rest of that drive, about what it had taken to stand on a corner and watch and document and testify and carry all of it forward without anyone asking her to, and without any guarantee that it would matter. about how the work of a witness, the real unglamorous patient work of paying attention and keeping records and showing up in rooms where you are asked to say what you saw. How that work was, the thing the whole apparatus depended on. In the end, the thing that no amount of federal protocols or anchor systems or code black alerts could replace. All of those things produced the documentation and the intervention and the sentence. But the knowledge that it happened and what it cost that lived in people. And the people who carried it forward, who refused to put it down and walk away, were the reason any of it mattered beyond the four walls of a courtroom. He drove through the city and thought about all of it, and when he got back to the hotel, he called his mother and told her he was coming home that weekend. She said good. He meant it. She believed him. They talked until she fell asleep on the call, and he stayed on the line for a few minutes after listening to the sound of her breathing in the quiet of her apartment in North Philly before he said goodnight to her softly and hung up. The intersection of Colton Avenue and 7th Street 1 year on carries no marker and no notation. Cities don't put up markers for things like this. They don't need to. The people who lived it carry it instead. The father whose son is going to build things in the neighborhood they both came from. The student doing fine in Cincinnati. Evelyn Marsh walking her dog every morning on the block. She has watched for 11 years. The chief who wrote a referral, he should have written years earlier. The federal operative who sat in a cage and worked the problem because that was what he was built for, and because his mother had taught him long before any recruiter or any ranger's tab that the value of doing the right thing is not diminished by whether anyone is watching. The loading zone on Colton Avenue has a fresh yellow line. Somewhere in the city, a woman is walking her dog in the early morning light, paying attention. The truth once spoken clearly in a room where it can be heard and believed does not require a monument. It simply remains. If this story stayed with you, we'd be grateful for a like. It genuinely helps our channel reach more people who believe that accountability and truth still matter. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell. We'll see you in the next one. Stay thoughtful out there.